NDAs in churches cause a lot of problems. And if you've been watching the channel for long, you know how we feel about NDAs. And today's conversation is going to be a really interesting one because I'm talking to a pastor today and we literally met over a disagreement over an NDA. Yet, it may have turned into one of the most life giving conversations with a pastor that I've had in a long time. It resulted in me inviting him on the podcast. And I think today we're going to have some really good conversations about some really uncomfortable and tough topics that if more of us were willing to talk about, I think the church would be in so much better of a place. And I cannot tell you the amount of respect that I have for our guest today. So, welcome to the podcast, Daniel Golding, the pastor of Echoes Church. And Daniel, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about you and kind of Echoes and how we connected for this conversation?
Yeah, man, great to be here. Honored to be a part of this. I think it's an important conversation that is being had in, Big C Church today. I didn't grow up in the church world, got kind of radically saved when I was 19, met Jesus, and kind of everything changed. Got into vocational ministry at 22, served in a church under a really unhealthy leader and saw kind of the underbelly of what the church can be in its worst form. Left that church, moved out to Arizona about 8 years ago, and got to work for a really awesome and healthy church and kind of see what the church can be in its best form. And probably 3 years ago, God really started to stir my heart, my wife's, to go plant a church. And so we started walking through that process. And in January of this year, we officially launched Echoes Church out in Phoenix. And it's been awesome. It's been a really incredible story that God's been writing. And it's kind of, we've had some pretty early success, and it's created some opportunity to have some conversations. And I think our relationship started because I was on a panel speaking and somebody asked a question about NDAs, and I answered the question with the context and understanding that I had at the time. Again, I've said to a couple people that have asked me about my answer I gave then, I would answer it differently today. I would give it a little bit more of a caveat, but yeah, regardless, man, super excited to be here. I do believe that, God brought our paths together at the time that he did because it's an important conversation. We are in the very beginning stages of setting up all of our processes and procedures. And, we want to do this thing well. We think that being a part of the church is the most incredible and high calling that we could possibly have. And we don't want to screw it up.
Well, I was talking to a friend, a mutual friend of ours, just the other day, and I told him some of my favorite churches to work with are actually church plants because it's so much easier to be intentional and create safe cultures and mechanisms and kind of boundaries that protect us from ourselves and our own naivety. It's easier to do that at the beginning. It's much harder to do that when you're established church and you've been there for forever. So I think with you guys being a new church, I think it made this conversation a lot easier. And I know you didn't just get reached out, from me, but you had, I think Mike Winger and some others who reached out as well. Hopefully those conversations were all really good and life giving. But I remember hearing this panel at the Bless God Summit. And to kind of sum it up for our listeners that may not have heard it, and I talked on our interview with Ruslan, I talked about it. So you can go check that out for a little bit more detail. But essentially, I remember hearing a tension in your voice that I don't think an everyday person would have heard. So I knew people were going to be asking about that clip. I knew people were going to be seeing it and going, whoa, they really propped up NDAs. It sounds like they were really taking up for NDAs. One of the things you said was, I think this whole NDA thing has got blown out of proportion, that it's not as bad as, people are making it out to be. I think a lot of people heard that. Being someone who spent 17 years in local ministry, I heard the other side in your voice. I heard a tension of he's saying this and he believes it, but he's also wrestling with this in real time. And man, those panels are so hard because you're answering in real time. You're trying to get as many questions as possible. But I heard a tension
Yeah.
in your voice, and I talked to Ruslan about that, and he said, "Well, talk to Daniel about it because I think you'll probably hear that tension when you talked." And when we talked, I definitely heard that. So we had this conversation starting off a disagreement. It would have been really easy for you to look at me, look at Church Disrupted, Spiritual Abuse Institute, and say, "Hey, they say some hard things about churches. This guy's just critical. I don't want to talk to him." Yet you engaged in a really productive, good faith dialogue. So, one, I would love to know, why did you do that? What made you do that? Because that's so abnormal. But also, what was that tension that I heard in your voice? Because when I told you that, I think you were grateful for it as well, because you said there was a tension and this is what I was wrestling with. And even hearing you now to say, I would say that differently if I could say it again. So, I would love to hear, what was that tension in your voice, but also, with it being so abnormal for people to engage in these conversations, what made you willing to speak with someone who could easily be labeled a critic?
Yeah, again, I think because I've gotten to see some of the worst parts of what church can be when it's really unhealthy, I think there was a reality that was there of like, again, I think some of it was, and I do think, right, we are very much a pendulum swinging culture, right? And it feels like things move very quickly. And the church has been just in such a state of criticism of late. I do feel like that I have a responsibility to protect the church and defend the church. And man, I love the church, and I think you do too. I just am convinced that the church is the hope of the world, and it's an incredibly important thing. But I also understand that, man, it can also, when being led by humans like us, it can create a lot of hurt and a lot of pain and a lot of trauma and difficulty, and so I felt like I was trying to defend the church while also not trying to speak with like a really broad stroke. And I think in fairness, even in my conversations with you and Mike Winger, like I've heard things about NDAs that legitimately I had never heard in my life before. And it's been a really, I think, eye-opening thing to me. I think my understanding of what NDAs and non-disparagement clauses were for and how to utilize them, yeah, I've had to learn a lot, and I think the beauty of being a church planter and being somebody that didn't grow up in the church world is it's pretty easy for me to just go like, man, I don't know what I don't know, and I want to learn and I want to get better. I think we just have a struggle as humans when we get to a place in any place in our life where we're being challenged to change our mind is one of the most difficult things in the world, right? I just was reading a thing I'm going to use in a sermon in a couple weeks where there was a doctor in the early 1800s that he essentially was trying to figure out why women, he was delivering babies. It was him and a bunch of doctors, but women at his clinic were dying at 5 times the rate at the local midwife's clinic down the street. And he couldn't figure out why. And then he started to try to connect the dots into why are women dying here, but not with the midwives? He started to wonder if maybe because they were, as doctors, they were also doing autopsies in between the deliveries, that maybe there was a connection there because the midwives didn't do any autopsies. And so he had a hypothesis and just told the doctors, hey, let's try just washing our hands in between doing an autopsy and doing a delivery, right? And immediately they cured the death rate of women at the birth clinic. The problem was is he couldn't explain why or how it was happening. So he tried to send out a national memo to all the doctors saying, hey, we've seen this amazing thing. And if you want to see the death rate of women during deliveries drop in your, offices, start washing your hands. And the crazy part is the medical community completely rejected him. He ends up dying. It's a really tragic story. You can go look up. He ends up dying in an insane asylum about 4 years later because he was trying to prove that he was correct on something, but he couldn't say why. And it took almost 40 years later in the 1840s when, microbiology and bacteria was understood of, oh, that's why when you wash your hands, these women weren't dying. All that to say, it really just illustrates like when we have our mind made up about something, trying to change our mind about that, all these doctors could hear was that you think we're dirty. And because you think we're dirty, the notion that you would want me to wash my hands is preposterous. And you are standing against the collective reasoning of what the medical community says. And again, I think a posture of leadership is one that you have to hold, like you being right loosely and be willing to, have conversations and change when you need to change.
Yeah, man, that's such a good illustration for this because, like, I don't know what sermon you're using it for, but that's perfect for this conversation. Like, there's
Yeah.
so many layers there. I'll probably forget them before we even get to all of them. But you talk about, I think within 4 months, you said he was in an insane asylum, and I think about that's one of the number one things that I hear from religious trauma survivors. These are people who love Jesus deeply, and now they can't even go to the church without getting sick because of something that they've experienced. And one of the things I hear most often is they say, I just started feeling like I'm crazy, or every day I have to wonder, am I crazy? Because people are telling me this thing's not a big deal. Yet I look at scripture and it is. People inside the church are telling me I'm just hurting the church. And people inside my family or people around me who aren't a part of the church go, that's not normal. And it feels so crazy making that a lot of people never disclose anything and they're just trying to get away from it. The problem is we don't actually heal that way. It ends up just making us feel more crazy. But I also think you talked about those doctors saying all we hear is not that you're trying to protect these women. That's not what they heard. What they heard first and foremost was you're saying we're dirty, right? And I think the lens we look through as church leaders, it matters so much because of our first lens. And you and I talked about this offline, but if our first lens is let's protect the church, meaning the people of the gathering, okay, rather than our first lens is let's protect the institution of the church and the leaders of the organization, we make very different decisions based on that lens. And we may get to talk about this here in a little bit, but even when you were going through kind of the NDA that you guys use with your attorney, one of the light bulb moments was when you asked your attorney, you said, "Hey, look at this through the lens of, protecting people and not protecting our reputation." And he said that changed everything. How do we as pastors and church leaders, because it feels like the reputation of the institution is the reputation of Jesus. Yet I would say the reputation of Jesus is more the reputation of how we care for people. How do we shift that lens so we don't just say, hey, stop calling me dirty, I'm not going to listen to you, and instead say, we could save lives, we could protect people? How do we practically shift that lens to where it doesn't feel like an attack on us when someone calls foul?
Yeah, I think again, I think a lot of it is just inviting conversation and inviting accountability and transparency to some degree. I think the only reason that accountability and transparency is not a high value is when there's something you don't want exposed, right? And I think to some degree, I think a really healthy church will build almost every single process and procedure with the notion of believing, hey, outside of the grace of God, like all of us are capable of anything. And if we actually believe that to be true, then let's build a system that doesn't let us actually go and do that. You know what I mean? And I think like for us, we put so much time because the church I came from, there was a lot of financial abuse. And a lot of it was just because the systems that would stop and protect that from being possible were never put into place. And so we spent a lot of time making sure, hey, these mechanisms are in place. Like you literally, even if I get hit by a bus tomorrow and a new senior pastor comes in that has malintentions and is trying to do something shady financially, they literally can't do it. There's too many mechanisms that are in place. They would have to go through so many changes to get so many different people to sign off on things. Like you just can't do anything. And so I don't know why we don't approach everything with the same idea, right? Of like, hey, collective, right? The scriptures literally say that in the counsel of many men is much wisdom. So let's leverage the wisdom of many people. Let's listen to the stories of what is happening while also not. And again, I think that there's a really, I think, tough line to toe because there is so much criticism around the church right now. And I think that there are some people that potentially are like borderline, demonically animated with what they're doing towards the church with the heart of accountability and transparency. So how do we not, move so far to the right where the church borderline becomes the enemy, but also go, hey, there is a balance in here that we can have a conversation where not all criticism is incorrect, right? And if we as the people that are in the church and leading the church, if we're a part of the conversation, then we can help shape this versus I think sometimes we just stay out of it, right? We're either too busy, we're just not, it's just not high enough of a priority. And so it just kind of keeps going as status quo. I think there's also a new wave of pastors that are coming in. I think we're watching a big, generational changeover in the Big C church happen. And I think what has gotten us here as a church will not get us where we need to go as a church.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Daniel. We don't always notice this. And this is just, again, I spent 17 years as a local church pastor. I spent over a decade as a national church consultant. And then now I'm leading this organization, young nonprofit organization trying to set the example for churches, but also trying to stop spiritual abuse. So some churches see us as a partner, some churches see us as an enemy, and some churches love what we're doing and are scared to death to talk to us because they're not sure where we're at. But I think often the way we respond to try to protect the institution, again, looking at that lens, are we protecting the people or the institution? The more we try to protect the institution, even if it's with a good heart, I think the more gasoline we pour on the fire we're trying to put out. So if the fire we're trying to put out is we don't want to harm the reputation of the church, by trying to just get these things to go away, we end up harming the reputation of the church. I think even more so by trying to get people to stop attacking the church and trying to just, hey, let's get this to go away. Let's say it wasn't that big of a deal. Let's, just try to move on with fake accountability, all those sorts of things. That actually causes more people to attack the church. And I think it causes people from outside the church and people who are just in their pain, have malice toward the church and want to tear it all down. It causes more of those people to come out versus when we lean into the tension and we say, hey, yeah, this was wrong. Like we don't even know how we got here. Like this is not okay. Yet we serve a God of grace. We got to lean into this, talk about this, figure this out. It's more akin to, instead of attacks, what people see that as is, well, this is us calling our own fouls. And when somebody calls their own fouls, we tend to respect that. So like, I don't know if you're an NBA fan, but part of watching the NBA in the 90s versus watching the NBA today, it's really different because it seems like everybody's always got their hands up like, come on, they're fouling me, they're fouling me, they're fouling me. But if we're playing a pickup game, the people you respect most are the ones that can go, my bad. I fouled you hard.
Yeah.
That was on me. Let's stop. That's not a big deal because when we're playing pickup, most guys are not gonna say, "Hey, you fouled me, man," until it's boiled over. So it's integrous to say that was on me, my fault, right? So one of the things I even mentioned to Ruslan, because he's a friend of both of ours, but I told him was, I said, I think a reformation of sorts is coming. And the question is, does the reformation come from us calling our own fouls on the floor? Does it start with church leadership and then we have a voice into it? Or do we ignore what's going on the floor for so long that eventually the crowd stands up and starts throwing things? And when the crowd stands up and starts throwing things, we're in a whole worse situation, right? I was talking to a person the other day who's very much so for the church. I'm not going to drop their name because I don't want to cause them any issues, but pastors trust them a lot. Don't trust us a lot in a lot of situations. But we were going over our Safe Church pledge, and one of the things they said that I wanted to get your insight on, they said, Jeff, I don't see a single thing on the Safe Church pledge that I have a problem with. But I will say some of it's uncomfortable. It's good. It's not, but it's just uncomfortable. And she said, I think the biggest issue that you're going to have is you're going to have to fight a lot of ego and a lot of pride to find pastors who are willing to say, this is good, even though it's a little uncomfortable for me. So, as people who are trying to speak into the church and say, we love the church, therefore we're calling foul, not attacking, and from the perspective of pastors who are saying, I love the church and I'm tired of people attacking it, how can we fight through that barrier of ego, that barrier of pride, and be willing to actually engage in these conversations and make the changes to where people really can't call foul? Because if something's gone wrong, we've already done it.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think your illustration of pickup basketball, it does fall apart if you're talking about playing against Ruslan in pickup basketball, because that guy cries foul for everything, bro. Like we were in a Monday night men's Bible study, and we would play basketball every week before Bible study, and man, that guy cried about a foul every time because he just would miss a shot. But
I'm gonna have to clip
yeah,
that, by the way, and put that out with no church context whatsoever, but just for Ruslan.
yeah, it's great. Yeah. Again, man, I am with you. I feel there is a reformation of sorts that is coming. And I think that the reckoning is needed. I think that the conversations are long overdue. And I think, again, a big part of it is that the internet has made it to where information is readily available. And the abuse that has gone on for a long, long time from the beginning of time, right? That the problem with power is abuse comes with it. It's not new. I think the burden of church leadership is, like you said, this can either happen with us standing on the sidelines, just doing our thing, and in my belief, continuing to lose credibility with the world, or we can be a part of the conversation. And I think, again, it's probably naive, and it's probably just because it's the circle of guys that I run with. most of the guys that I'm around are like, man, we want accountability. We want people to trust a local church. We want to show that we're trying to do this differently and that we're, like we didn't get into this to try to build a mansion and get a plane and to build our own empires, but we really do believe that the greatest force of good in the world is supposed to be the local church when done correctly. Can it, has it, and will it continue to be abused? Unfortunately, yes. But I think that what we need is a lot of newer pastors that are willing to be a part of this conversation, and just go, hey, we don't have to be afraid of accountability. We don't have to be afraid of checks and balances. And I think together with mutual, reciprocity, mutual respect, like we can build something that is sustainable, that is God honoring, that is not hurting people, and I think that's my heart in wanting to have these conversations. I think I started to realize like, okay, this conversation is happening, whether I want to be a part of it or not. And because I love and respect the church so much, and I feel like God asked me to give my life to building it, that I want to be a part in whatever my voice can help lend to this conversation. I want to be a part of it. And I think most guys that I know sit in the same position saying like, hey man, we're all for this. Let's make some changes.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a tension that we hold on to, man, because Daniel, the reality is, I love the church so much. I would rather have more conversations than put more of our effort into. And this is SAI's plan. We want to put more of our effort into helping people heal from spiritual abuse and religious trauma and re engage with safe churches. That doesn't mean perfect, but it means safe. And we tell them you can have a church on a safe church pledge. And that doesn't mean they're abuse proof. But what it means is spiritual abuse is hard to hide and even harder to get away with. And when it's uncovered, they've decided in advance here's what we're going to do to be protective. And if you see your church not doing those things, well, now you have a third party with us where you can contact us and be safe without having to go straight to your pastor and say, hey, these things they committed to, they're not doing, well, then we can reach out in good faith and go, hey, it was probably an oversight, but we noticed this is missing. What can we do to help you over the 90 days, the next 90 days to get it right? Or hey, this didn't match your commitment. How can we help you to do that, right? I would rather spend our days helping people heal and re-engage with healthy churches, propping up safe churches, churches that are trying their best rather than having to talk about the ones that get it wrong. But there's a tension. We've got to do the post mortem and say how are we getting it wrong. And I told a friend yesterday, we got a series that we're going to do soon, Daniel. That instead of just talking about hey, this scandal happened, what can we learn from it? It's going to be the unmaking of a scandal, and we're going to actually go through scandals that everybody else knows and says, hey, where could this have been stopped? What can we learn from this the whole way so that this doesn't happen again? And how can we literally unmake these things? So we got to talk about that. But I would much rather talk about the healthier churches. The issue is so often we're so insulated, and it is that fear that we don't join the conversation, and then it gets harder. Because I agree with you. I think the majority of pastors and churches, are especially young ones right now, are wanting to do it a different way. We want to be a part of serving them, helping them, and pointing people toward those churches because I think people are desperate to find those
Yeah.
churches, but those churches may not be the ones that you've ever heard of. They may not be the really popular ones or the really big ones. That doesn't mean the big ones are bad. So I think it's such a tension. And that's my prayer is that we can continue to connect with people like you, who we can have these conversations with, even walk through disagreement so that we can get to a place of saying, hey, what we do all agree on is we love Jesus and we want to protect the sheep that Jesus has given us. I think about the Reformation, and when I look back on it, I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can do this differently than the last Reformation went. Because as Protestants, we look at the Reformation fondly, but the reality is the Reformation also brought a ton of division. And whether it was needed or not, you had essentially two churches at that point, Catholic and Orthodox, that has now split into thousands and thousands and thousands of churches. There's a lot of argumentation and fragmentation. We've lost the ability to disagree, in holy unity in a lot of ways because we can be unified while disagreeing. But when I look back at it and I look at church history, I look at leaders who weren't willing to join the conversation and call their own fouls until it was too late. And if they'd done it earlier, I'm not sure that this Protestant split would have ever happened, right? But I also look at
Um,
the printing press is what enabled it. And I look at social media now giving everybody a voice. how do we not repeat the same mistake? How do we use this as a way to bring more unity instead of a whole nother schism?
Yeah, no, I'm 1,000% with you. I agree. I think the irony, the more you look into the Reformation and what was actually being argued, there could have been a big wake up moment for the Catholic Church, and the Protestant break off never even happens, right? I think that's the part that I am appreciative of. It's I think channels like yours, I think channels like Ruslan's, channels like Mike Winger's, it is what the media has always been to politics, right? There's a level where we need outside independent journalists to keep people accountable, because our natural propensity is towards destruction, right? Is towards creating systems that are good for me and not for thee. And and I think we just need to, I think, do the same thing. I think everybody has the same intent, and honestly, I think that even friends of mine that are pastors of churches that are using NDAs and non-disparagement clauses, like I was, if they were exposed to the conversations that I've been exposed to on the other side of talking with you, with Mike Winger, I mean, enlightening is an understatement. I mean, I had no idea that churches were using these as part of an onboarding process, right? And it was, and then you see how they're silencing people and the ways that, like, some of that stuff is just crazy to me. And it feels like the system is actually being created to silence people versus the heart behind these, at least from the church's standpoint, is to protect the church, right? And to protect the people that are in it. And so, yeah, I think it's a necessary conversation we've got to lean into. And let's not, exactly like you said, let's not make the same mistake and create a bunch of division. Because again, I think we also right now are potentially on the verge of another major move of God's Spirit, right? Like a revival that we haven't seen since the Jesus movement, I think is stirring again in our nation. And I think that the conversations are incredibly important.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that. I'm a church history nerd and I struggle through church history because, I went to, and I've told Ruslan this, offline, but I went to multiple different schools that couldn't be farther apart, theologically. Like I went to an independent fundamental Baptist seminary, and then I've also went to, I've done work at Princeton, and, that kind of Presbyterian, really liberal, kind of leaning stuff. And I've done work in between. So when I'm even go through church history textbooks and stuff, it's always difficult because I want to see it at all the angles. But one of the things I've been challenged by, almost haunted by, is what if the Protestant Reformation, what if what God wanted from that was not a reformation? What if what he wanted was a revival and a reawakening? And instead, because we couldn't handle it well, because we couldn't call our own fouls, it turned into what it turned into, which came with both good and bad. But if that's the case, it could be the same thing now. If we're willing to embrace this conversation, God is calling us to something beautiful that brings more unity. But you got a unique experience, unique perspective as a pastor that I think helps for these conversations because you love the church. You want to protect the church. Like your heart for the church is super evident. At the same time, you've been through some pretty deep, gnarly church hurt. I would say from some of the things that I know, probably, I call it spiritual abuse. It's probably left you with some trauma, some real trauma. So now you're a pastor, you're in the lead role. And there's two ways that trauma affects pastors. One is we say, I don't want to do that to other people, which is a very healthy response. The other one is to say, I've gotten hurt being a pastor and I want to protect myself and make sure I don't get hurt again. That one tends to lead us to really unhealthy things because we'll protect ourselves and the system that we're around rather than protecting other people. So how has your church pain experience, your trauma experience actually impacted how you pastor and how you lead today? Because I know it's changed the way that you lead and the way you look at these things.
Yeah, no, 1,000%. And I don't even think I fully appreciated and realized the depth and the levels of spiritual abuse that we had walked through until I got out of it and actually came out, and was a part of a really healthy church. And I think it was probably a couple months in, it started to really hit. I was like, oh man, I'm really, really broken from all of this stuff. There was a decent period there where I was sitting with my wife, with our senior pastor of that church, just going, I actually might be too broken to continue in this thing. Like I just started to realize, like, I have all this, you just don't realize the trauma that you carry with you until things start to come out. And you're in a healthy organization, but you can't function. And I was there. And luckily that church was incredible, helped pay, like paid for me to just go be in counseling, invested in me getting better without, any, hey, this is what's on the other side of this. And I was able to process through a lot of that stuff. And ironically, the funny part is it connects kind of to my childhood. I was, sexually abused as a kid. And I think as I got older and processed through that stuff, it was heartbreaking to realize that the majority of sex offenders are people who were sexually molested themselves, right? And I just, again, it's one of those things I just was like, I don't understand how, once you've walked through that, you could ever do that to somebody else. But I understand that trauma undealt with, it does some crazy stuff to us. And, and the guy that I worked for that ended up being a guy that was spiritually abusing tons of people, financially, robbing the church. I mean, just crazy, crazy stuff that he was doing. He was a really broken and hurt guy that was incredibly gifted and I don't think he ever had a season to process through the deep trauma of his past, right? He was adopted into a family that was they never really loved him the same way that they loved the other kids. And, and then he had such a gifting. That gifting grew a platform very quickly. And all of a sudden it was like, hey, you should go plant a church. And then he plants a church that blows up and there's never a time to really heal. And so on one side, I have a ton of grace towards him. But I think the flip side is like, bro, the amount of damage and like legitimate trauma. Like I know multiple people that were in ministry working for the church that are borderline not even Christians today because of what this guy did to them. You just look at it and you go, man, there's no excuse for this stuff, And then there's the part of like the sovereignty of God. You sit there and you're like, was this guy ever Christian? Like, how does all that, like you get into like all the soteriology questions and you're like, well, what is all this? Like it's just a big conversation, and 1,000% I'm grateful for the hard things that I've walked through. It shapes how I see things today. I feel like I'm a pastor that walks with a limp. I've been through some stuff. And so it's really easy for me to look at somebody and just go, man, you're welcome here in your brokenness because we're all broken, myself included. And so, yeah, I don't wish what we had walked through on anybody else, but I also understand that it was part of what God used to get us to where we are today. But, I'm also thankful that I had a season to heal and, there's a season of isolation before promotion. And, had that not happened, I don't know, I could have been another story of what happens when a person that has a gift gets a platform pretty quickly. So,
Well, man, it's healing's hard. Healing's uncomfortable. Like, I have never went to a therapy session that I wanted to go to. It's always uncomfortable. I'm always grateful I went after, right? But healing's uncomfortable, and I think for the majority of church staff that go through spiritual abuse, I think the most common response is either one, it's what you said, I'm too broken. Even when I'm in a healthy place, I'm seeing ghosts. I'm ready to fight everything and anyone and everything. And I felt that way for a while. So I think there are a whole lot of people that say, I don't think I can continue and step away from ministry. And when I stepped away from ministry, it was after walking through the healing because I didn't want to step away just for that reason. But I realized, hey, God's got a different kind of ministry for me. And I don't know that I can do the ministry He's called me to in the church, right? And now looking back on it in hindsight, I had no idea what was coming, but God did. But I think the other response is, okay, if I think I can do this, well, then if I'm going to do this, I'm never going to be hurt again. Especially because usually for pastors, it's not just the spiritual abuse that maybe I got from another pastor, it's also the trauma that I've gotten from parishioners. I've got some of the greatest trauma I've ever had was from a deacon. It wasn't from, a pastor, right? So you carry in all that. So I think for the ones that say, okay, well, I'm going to stay, if we don't heal, the common response is, I'm going to make sure this never happens to me again. I'm going to make sure I don't get hurt again. I don't get burned again. And in doing so, we become what hurt us, right? It's very uncommon for people to do what you did, which is, I'm going to go through the work of healing. But even when you said that, if you hadn't had people who supported you in that, if you didn't have a church that supported you in that, you probably wouldn't have went down that road on your own. So, the Safe Church Pledge, it is filled with intentional things we're asking pastors and churches and elders to do to protect people. But one of the things that not enough people are talking about, and sitting with a friend the other day talking about it, and I said, "Hey, remember, one of the requirements is that there's counseling available, paid counseling available for the senior pastor and hopefully other church members. And I think it should be one of the first budget line items for a church when it's planted. Our senior pastor has access to therapy. We're going to be asking if they need it because hurt people do hurt people. The adage is true. Healed people always help people heal. So it's very important to us at Spiritual Abuse Institute that we're not just saying, hey, let's put all these guardrails in place. But one of the biggest guardrails that we can put in place is say, let's serve our senior pastors and senior leaders and say, hey, they're carrying a lot. They've likely been through trauma. And if we don't tell them it's okay to heal, if we don't actually invest in that, then they may not ever know how to pursue that. So I think that's huge to be able to walk people through that. Let's talk about Echo's NDA though. And I want to start out with something you didn't get to talk about at the Bless God Summit. I think it's important here. We talk negatively about NDAs because most NDAs that I see are negative. At the same time, we want to be very clear that not all NDAs are bad. And on our Safe Church Pledge, we break down this is what constitutes a silencing NDA. There's no place for those in the church. But NDAs that are protecting counseling information and donor information, basically a document that is protecting parishioners, that's a good thing, right? So your heart was in the good. Tell me, when you guys were creating as a young church, you're already creating this NDA. What was the heart behind it? Because there's some really good things and good heart behind it, and why we don't need to just throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, never have an NDA.
Yeah. Again, I think because as pastors and ministers, I mean, I was in a counseling session yesterday with a couple that's trying to come back from some really, really intense abuse. And I know some things. I've been privy to some things in their relationship because of my role as a pastor in their life. That if it was somebody else on my staff and they knew that information about those people, when they're leaving staff, I don't want that information to ever get out because I want to protect them. Like they're in such a vulnerable place right now of trying to rebuild on such a broken foundation of what their marriage has been. The last thing I would want is for them to go, well, then the pastor went and told a bunch of people about what we're walking through, right? Or they have access to because of their role, and not every role will have this, but they know financial information. They know which families are giving big amounts of money or which families have a lot of money that don't give anything, right? And that information then gets out. And there's just a lot of sensitive stuff, right? Again, one of those things that people don't love is that there is a business element to the church as well, like where we're planning future campuses, land that we're looking to acquire. A vindictive person could go to a church down the street and say, hey, this land came up, this thing it's available. It's stuff like that you want protected. And I think just like in a senior pastor role, you can get a crazy person. In every staff role, you can have people that, have a mental health break, or there was things that were there you just didn't realize until you started working together. And then you start to have these conversations and you're like, hey, there's this consistent theme where you're not telling the truth. And so what we've always wanted is some type of document that says, look, we want to make sure you land well and on your feet, right? And we're going to do X, Y, and Z to help you get there. But we also want to make sure that you're not out there saying things that are protected information about the church. And also you're not spreading non-truth statements about who we are, right? And I think that's the simplicity that I was thinking through the lens of like, oh, that's all it's ever used for. And so people got to stop making such a big deal about NDAs. And then I had some conversations and my eyes were opened up to what they're actually being used for. And it's so much more than that. I think that's what I think the people using them in abusive ways would say that they're being used for. But it's very clear that they know coming in, we're doing some really shady, weird crap. And we just want to make sure that we have the ability to keep you from telling anybody about that. And I think that is for sure something that is not honoring God, is not helping build the church, is not helping restore the credibility of the church, you know. And again, it goes back to the whole Protestant Reformation stuff. I think the interesting part is, I'm in the non-denominational world. You don't have any denominational oversight, right? So you're creating a lot of these systems. And now as a guy that just went through the process of building our church from the ground up, like the legal entity as well as the, physical church and all of that, you do understand like there would be, and I am definitely pro some oversight in this because outside of us willing to self-govern in a lot of areas, you could 1,000% build a system that is really unhealthy because it's a pretty broad spectrum thing.
Well, you even said earlier at one point, you said, I don't know why people wouldn't want to be more above reproach. I don't know why we wouldn't want to do those things. And I've said that same thing. I find myself saying a lot now, though, because building SAI, again, one of our values is we want to set the example for churches. I can't push on a church financially if we're not financially above reproach. So even the past couple of weeks, we've been doing things to become more financially above reproach. We got boundaries everywhere. Like you said with the financial stuff, so many people would have to sign off on it. Nobody could undo this. But I find myself on a regular basis going, God, this is so much harder than I wish it was. And I have to remind myself out loud, being above reproach is hard, but it's worth it. So I think that's a reason why a lot of people don't do it because it is harder, but I think it's always worth it more, in the long run. And I want people to know when I looked at y'all's NDA the first time, when I actually saw it, because you were open not only to talk with me about this, but Daniel, it blew my mind when you were willing as a pastor to share that NDA with me. We've seen a lot of NDAs. They're usually anonymously submitted. We don't get any from pastors. Okay, I think yours was the first one that a pastor shared and said, this is what we're using. And when I saw yours, I was like, hey, 95% of this is actually really spot on because everywhere you had a protection, you would also clearly say, this is what it's not. Like, we're not trying to hide anything illegal. We're not trying to keep you from talking about these things. And I so appreciated it. My biggest concern with it, and I think this is a great conversation to have, on the podcast, but my biggest concern was that there was a non-disparagement clause. And I started sharing with you how non-disparagement clauses, one, are used, but two, and this was a conversation that Ruslan and I had as well, what disparagement means versus defamation. Because what a lot of churches say they're protecting against is actually defamation. We don't want people destroying the reputation of our church by saying false things. And they don't realize there are already laws out there that protect that. It's
Mm.
okay to remind people of those laws in a contract, but disparagement goes farther because disparagement could be you can't say anything that might embarrass us or hurt our reputation, even if it's true. And those are so broad and silencing that the National Labor Review Board made them illegal a few years back with secular corporations for anybody who's not like executive level management. But churches can still use them legally. So when I remember sharing that stuff with you, and it was, I didn't get the impression that you had any clue that that's how those could be used or that's what that meant. So you went through, I don't want people to know before you talk about that, you went through and you made a ton of changes. You and your staff to this, you've sat down with attorneys, you made changes to this. Even before we hit record on the podcast today, there was still a word in there that I said, that word I think is going to confuse people with silencing. And you just got in the document and changed it. You're like, okay, well, we're not using that word anymore. So as you walk through this process, you talked with me, with Mike Winger, with some others. What did you learn about NDAs that surprised you the most? And how did it impact you being able to make the changes you did as you read through your NDA with that new lens? Like, what did you see that you said, hey, this could be misused, so we're just going to go ahead and stop that?
Yeah, again, I think it's important to note. I think in most arenas of life, you're not creating like you're not building an entire document from scratch, right? You walk through the process where you have somebody you got to offboard from your staff that like didn't go super well. And so you reach out to either the HR company that you use or you reach out to pastor friends that you have and just go, hey, how do you guys do this? And then they send you their document, right? So you just take it, you go, cool, this is how the church world functions. And all of this stuff, again, the heart of a non-disparagement clause, from my understanding, was to stop people from saying disparaging things about the church. But I think what I've since learned is the heart and the intent of what you mean something to be and the legal definition of what it actually is are two completely separate things. And what we learned, and again, the conversation with our attorney was when I finally asked her to review it from a standpoint of like, hey, obviously your default is to protect us as a church. And I appreciate that. But think about it from a standpoint of like, I don't want somebody to sign this that had something true happen to them, but because it would be embarrassing to us as the church because of the legal definition of something that they still have their hands tied. Like, I don't want to create that. And so how do we navigate that? And that's where the final language stuff was changed. And again, the conversation you and I had before this was about the term non-disparagement clause, and that can be a broader spectrum thing. And again, it feels a bit of like splitting hairs to me, but if it really is like, hey, to avoid people feeling traumatized and with this, that we just changed it to what I changed it to, which is, hey, this is what this agreement is an agreement of mutual respect. We are not going to say negative things about you after you've left here. When future employers call us for a reference, we're not going to say bad things about you. What we're asking you to do is to not say untruthful things about us as well, right? If there's something true that happened that was abusive or whatever, say it. Like there's nothing about this agreement that is stopping you from saying that. I just don't want you to say things that are not true. And I don't want you to say things that are that's protected information about people that are in our church that you were privy to because of your role in the church. And if we can stack hands on that and go, hey, let's part ways. This just was it didn't work out. Man, I love that. But I think the biggest thing that I would say to pastors that are out there that listen to this, I honestly was really kind of blown away at how broad spectrum terms like non-disparagement clause is and non-disclosure agreements, how they can be, if not really, really defined and potentially found better words for them because you get into the legal jargon of things, right? And so, yeah, I think that was the biggest eye-opening thing for me in this process for sure.
Well, and you went above and beyond things I didn't even ask you to do that were just so encouraging to me when I reread it. Because, for instance, you all have mutual terms, which is something that we talk about. A good NDA always has mutual terms. Most church NDAs that we see do not. And y'all says, hey, we're not just asking you not to say these things. We're asking you essentially not to defame us. Don't say anything false and misleading to try to hurt us. And don't share anything that would hurt somebody in the congregation, like their personal information. Yet you all commit to not disparage them at all, right? So the higher level of integrity is actually what you're committing to do. So even though it's mutual terms, you're holding the church and the church leaders to a higher standard of respect and honor than those people, right? So that really stood out to me. Y'all went above and beyond to make it clear, and it's in clear language. We are not silencing you from, talking about anything that was illegal or talking about anything that you need to disclose. And this is something so simple and contractual. This may be boring to some people, but every time we talk about what makes a good NDA, there's two things we talk about that you rarely see in church NDAs. One is those mutual terms, but two is there's an end date on it, because every bit of information, like you never want to hold somebody to something like for forever. Like that's a lot hanging over their head. So, when you talked about like property stuff and things like that, so we may have a decision we made as a church staff. This is confidential, a project that we're working toward. It doesn't need to get out to other people, but that's not a forever thing, right? So I think you guys put 2 years. I think that this holds you, to 2 years on those things. So bravo, you guys did a really good job of going back through it. And it was one that I told you I would be confident sending this to any church and saying, this is kind of the gold standard for me on what a good NDA should look like from a church, because this protects the people of the church. It doesn't just protect the institution. So I think you guys knocked it out of the park with it. And if we were never willing to have that conversation, if you hadn't been willing to jump on the phone with someone who you could easily just label as a critic, then we may have
Yep.
never gotten here. If you weren't willing to talk to, Mike Winger, you may not have gotten here. So I think you guys did a fantastic job with it. I may send this to you because I don't know if you got a chance to listen to the conversation I had with Ruslan, but I showed Ruslan the NDA that my wife was asked to sign by a church. And the difference, man, like y'all's is so short, theirs was a lot longer. And the legal definition of non disparagement got expanded and got expanded and got expanded to where it was literally in writing. You can't say anything that may even embarrass the church, right? So then you're scared to say anything. When somebody asks why, hey, why'd you leave? You're terrified to say why you left because it could be embarrassing. And you can't say, I can't talk about that because I, signed an agreement, because the existence of the agreement itself, you can't talk about, it's in the agreement. So I think when you stack an NDA like that we see so many of, and you stack that next to y'all's, man, it's totally different, because one is bathed in sunlight. There's nothing that's trying to be hidden there other than things that we all, I think, will agree upon and go, yeah, that should be kept confidential. And the other one feels like it's just full of cobwebs and in the dark and growing mold and gnarly stuff. So, man, I just want to say in front of everybody, I'm super grateful for the work that you all put in on that. And if I've got your permission, I'll share y'all's NDA with other churches when we're having these conversations in the future, because I think you did awesome.
Yeah, man. Yeah, of course, 1,000%. And, thank you for the kind words. The funny part is I'm sitting here having these conversations because, Mike Winger reached out because he was getting ready to make a reaction video to go after why I was wrong. And after having a conversation, it was like, well, that isn't what I meant. And I didn't realize this was the context. And so a lot of it, truthfully, like a lot of this started with me saying something that was not completely well informed. And had I had the context, so I said to you, I said to Mike, I would answer the question different, right? I think with the understanding that I have now, I was telling you before this, the guy that I, experienced spiritual abuse under, he wasn't smart enough to use NDA. So I've never seen these before. The churches I've worked for, it's never been a part of, our church staff at all. The large church that I was on staff at for a long time, there was no NDAs. There was nothing like that. So my assumption was, as people are using them, it's this very limited, small scope. It's really, and then to see and hear what it is, I'm like, holy cow, I had no idea, right? So I appreciate the opportunity to get informed and to have people that are, more experts in this field help us figure out how to build something that creates accountability and, furthers transparency and not culture with a bunch of cobwebs everywhere.
Well, one of the things I told Ruslan, I've told him on the podcast, but I've told him, multiple times on the phone and through text. I'm like, hey man, if I've got a Achilles heel, I'm going to be too critical to the church because of what I've seen, because I've seen some of the worst, darkest parts of the underbelly. And when I tell him, I say, if you've got, a concern, it's that you're too naive. But I've also told him, and he laughs about this, but I said, I think you're too naive because you're around so many people like Daniel, so that when you ask to see an NDA, you're seeing something like this, or you think, oh, that's what they all are. And I'm like, no, bro, this is amazing. Like, this is not what we normally see. And then he's willing to have conversations on top of it. So thank you for setting the gold standard on that. I want to think for just a couple of minutes, because as we're winding our time down, there's a lot more scandals that are coming out. It seems like that has increased, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. You can share if you want to on the reasons you think that are for that. I don't think scandals are happening more often. I think we now have the tools to shine the light on them, so they're being heard about more often. But we've got data behind this from Gallup that the trust in the institution of the church and its leaders is at an all-time low, right? So we have a problem to solve, because that shouldn't ever be the case. But as a pastor, what do you think church leaders need to do most? What can they do practically to live more above reproach and to protect not just the people of their church, but to protect the churches and themselves from more of these scandals and more of these leadership failures? Because at some point, we got to stop the bleeding on the scandals before we can rebuild trust. So, what do we do to stop the bleeding on the scandals? And then, two, what can we start practically doing to rebuild trust so that the world around us, who may not believe what we believe and may not see Jesus the way that we see him, they look at us and say, y'all are still trustworthy, and your lives are what we want our lives to look like.
Yeah, I do think that there is a national reckoning that I think God in his sovereignty is bringing, right? And I think it happens seasonally, right? I don't think, like you said, that what we're experiencing is some new rise of pastors doing shady stuff. I think that it's always been there. I think that the influx of platforms on YouTube, social media, has created a level of accountability and transparency that people can't get away from. There isn't a way to hide anymore. I think we're living on the other side of, the Me Too movement and all things like that that have brought much needed accountability and transparency to the church. The part that is really interesting to me is I think we're sitting at the exact same moment where church or the credibility of the church is at an all-time low, yet attendance in church is actually trending back up, right? And we're seeing Bible sales through the roof. And so I really do think that they're not disconnected. I think God in his sovereign will was this revival was getting ready to come, and there was a cleansing that was happening inside of the church. And so I think one of the big things that we need to do as pastors that are, again, we are just as frustrated, we are just as heartbroken over the scandals, is to stand up and say that, like, this is not okay. We are glad that there is a reckoning that is coming. We are we are not supporting abusers. We are not supporting, any of this stuff. I think we need to stand up and say that stuff. And I think we also got to help people see. And I think my heart, where I get really passionate about defending the church, is like Ruslan. I think a majority of these guys, I could tell you 25 amazing, faithful pastors to every one scandalous pastor that is out there, right? But it's, again, planes that land don't make the headlines. And we hear about all the craziness. And so I think we, to keep our credibility, have to stand up and agree, hey, this stuff is crazy. Like, we want the reckoning to come too, and not try to, justify it and explain it away and stay silent on it. I think we have to agree, stack hands on it, and also help elevate the voices of people that are trying their best to do everything they can to not end up there, right? Because I think the other truth is that nobody starts out with, even the guy that, fizzled out that I served under, he started that church with incredibly good intentions, right? But again, we are all capable of anything. And so I think the bigger question that I think you guys are an important part of helping solve is, how do we create some standards nationally that just say, hey, we are all also stacking hands on these things, right? That we're going to agree that there is like an irreducible minimum that we need to have in our churches for the sake of accountability. Because again, dude, I love you, I love Ruslan, but all of us, bro, you give us a bad couple months and we are all literally capable of anything. And so let's build these systems that protect the people from us, even though right now, man, we're in a good place and we're probably not going to abuse somebody tomorrow. But you give us 5 years and some really tough seasons of life, and maybe we're all capable of anything. So let's all stack hands on some independent outside things to go, look, we're all in agreement to these things, and then be able to show people like, hey, here's how we run these things, right? This is, I think part of that is really important.
Well, and I've heard, I think it was from Ruslan that I've heard that before. So that may have come from conversations with you, that idea that planes that land safely don't make the news. And it's so true. Yeah. And I kind of I'm kind of the captain attention. I know, Ruslan probably gets frustrated because almost every time we're talking about something, I'm living in the tension and going, it's not all good. It's not all bad. But that's just the way that I'm wired. But I look at the idea of, yes, planes that land safely do not make the news, and more planes land safely than not. At the same time, every plane that crashes makes the news. It makes big headlines, and we've got systems in place. You're looking at that black box, and we're doing everything we can, and there are going to be laws and regulations that are enacted off of that crash to make sure it's less likely to happen again. And we know more planes will crash, but the goal is to make it as limited as possible. And it's one of the safest forms of travel. And so I use that example to say, yes, there are more churches landing safely than not. Where the church, I think, has to get better, we got to get much better at opening the black box and discussing the headlines when they go wrong and saying, you know what, we're doing a post-mortem on this, and we're going to figure out what we can do to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And that's our goal with the Safe Church Pledge. And we won't do it today, man, but I would love if you got if you got the time at some point, because I know you're super busy as a pastor. But if you ever get the time and you're up for it, I would love to be interviewed by a pastor that simply goes through the Safe Church Pledge and goes, hey, here's what I love. Here's my concerns. How does we even do this? What does this look like? Is this necessarily the best way to go about it? Because we want to help establish those standards, and that's always going to be growing. That black box conversation has to always be happening, so that we're making sure as many planes land safely as possible. Because even though it's the majority of them that are safe, every plane that doesn't land safely, man, that's lives we never get back. And I think it's the same thing with the church. Every time there is spiritual abuse and trauma, those are people who never get their lives back the same way. Their faith is never the same. Even if they keep pursuing Jesus, it's just different. So we want to limit that trauma as much as we can. So let me do this just kind of as a last question, and then we'll land the plane on this interview. When you're thinking about that person who's been through such pain in the church that they love Jesus, yet they can't even go to the church without getting queasy, without getting sick, without having trauma responses, what would your encouragement to them be as a pastor who says, I love the church and I want you to come back, but I also understand what you've been through?
Yeah, I think that maybe unfortunately, being connected to a church is an essential part of our faith journey, right? It is such an important and critical part of our faith formation that we can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think for a lot of reasons, maybe it would be easier to be able to do that in some seasons. And so my biggest encouragement to them is that there's light on the other side of this. There's hope on the other side of this. I think the greatest lie that the enemy perpetuates is that there is no purpose to your pain. And I would say to them, there's incredible purpose in your pain. And I think the promise from heaven is that God will redeem all that the enemy has taken, right? I think that's the whole thrust of Romans 8:28 is that God will work all this stuff together for good that wasn't good. You gotta find a counselor, right? You gotta find somebody that can help you walk through this stuff. That could be potentially a pastor that has some counselor training, but I would really encourage you. I sat with an amazing, amazing Christian counselor for a year and processed through a lot of stuff. And the other side of it, you can be really healthy and really good. Again, it takes some time to walk through some of that stuff, but I've watched so many people because of her go through the process of deconstruction and land kind of nowhere. And that isn't really helpful either. And so do the hard work, lean in, and just believe that the promises of Scripture are true and that God can redeem this stuff for good and that there's purpose to the pain.
Well, man, thank you so much, not just for joining us today, but I'm super encouraged. I don't know if these are going to come out, these episodes in the same order that I've done them, but I've got to sit down with just a handful of pastors like you lately who are willing to talk about the issues, willing to say something needs to change. And man, I think it's so life giving, not just for me, but I know our community gets to hear pastors and they go, that guy feels safe. This feels different. And it's a reminder that there are many, many good pastors out there who are asking the tough questions and doing their best to be really good shepherds and to follow in the model of Jesus. So man, thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation today. Thank you for your willingness to be able to lay your ego and your pride aside to even have these conversations and then to go back and do the hard work in a matter of just a few weeks on that NDA. So just know you got Spiritual Abuse Institute, man. We are in your corner because you're having these conversations. And let people know just before you go if they wanted to connect with Echoes Church, how could they do that?
Yeah, man, I appreciate it, man. Honored to be here. So we're on Instagram. Everything is echoes.church. So Instagram is at echoes.church. And then, yeah, website is echoeschurch.com or just echoes.church. We'll get you there.
Well, I hope you guys have been as encouraged as I have been today. Let me know your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. And have you ever seen a church that's done an NDA well? Because this is very rare, something rare that I haven't seen. I was grateful to see it. But we'll be back with another episode, another conversation like this soon. Until then, grace and peace. We love you guys.